Welcome to Understanding Your Flute, Episode 1. I'm Dustin. You may be on my YouTube channel, which you find under my name, Dustin, D-U-S-T-I-N. And to begin with, we think about the Boehm method, the Boehm flute, as a fingering system. But in fact, Boehm gave us much more than that. He gave us this. He gave us our acoustic system. And so I have stripped this flute, not only to make you uncomfortable, but also to begin where he began for a better understanding of what he did. He gave us a cylinder bore, and he gave us the ideal diameter of cylinder for 3 octaves, as well as they can be played on the same diameter cylinder because it can't be changed. He gave us the ideal length, and he gave us the largest sound holes that he possibly could, attempting to make the sound hole as large as the diameter of the tube, at which he failed. He also failed to make them all as big as they could be. This is the C-sharp hole. It is a sound hole, and it's much too small and way high out of place. The principle is, the bigger a sound hole is, the farther down the tube it can be, approaching its proper place acoustically. What that means is the point where the tube would be cut off by a saw in exactly the right place for that pitch. This is impossible because they are all too small, because it's impossible to make a hole as big as the diameter of the tube. The C-sharp hole has 2 functions. It not only must function to play C-sharp, it ought to be way down here, of course, and much bigger, but it also must function as the vent for the octave. That is to say, it helps to make a node in the middle of a vibrating air column. Have you ever wondered why the clarinet, which is the same length as the flute, plays so much lower, a full octave lower? The oboe plays lower than the flute. When a reed instrument is played, the reed slaps against the top of the tube, closing it just about half the time. This is why reeds have numbers. A number 2 reed, a number 3 reed, that's the stiffness of the reed, its tendency to open back up after the player has slapped it, closing the end of the tube. Anyway, a reed instrument functions as a tube closed at one end, and therefore can play its fundamental. That is to say, a clarinet, and if you were to stick an oboe reed in here, or close this and stick an oboe reed in here, after you've taken the cork out, which has been taken out, this would play an octave lower. But a flute functions as a tube open at both ends. We never close it at the top. And a tube that is open at both ends can only play half of its length. There is always a node in the middle. So whereas a clarinet can play one long sound sausage inside vibrating air column, the flute always plays 2. And you may notice that this tiny little C-sharp hole ought to be up around here someplace, about a quarter of the distance to the end. This is about a third of the distance to the end, but it ought to be a quarter way up here. But if it was, it would not play C sharp. Wouldn't work. It'd be tiny, 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 and it wouldn't work. And if it was down here any farther, to make a better C sharp, it would not function very well to make a node in the middle of 1/2 of the upper sound sausage, which somehow affects the bottom one. I'm getting to the end of my understanding here. But this is why the C sharp hole has to be compromised. And you will remember, what was it, Anderson Opus 36 or Opus 32, those Anderson exercises you played as a student and should still be playing. Anderson is Joachim Anderson. I do not try to pronounce his name correctly, or neither do I try to pronounce Theobald Boehm correctly, is always asking you to play a C sharp in a very delicate place, softly, because it's the worst note on the flute, and it's the one you have to work at. And he knew this. He was writing in these exercises at the time when the Boehm flute was brand new, and he was the first guy to really con, C-O-N. It's an old-fashioned word. Really understand the flute, and that was his legacy, and this is what you're stuck with, and you have to learn to deal with it. So the flute, the Boehm flute, is a chromatic instrument, just like the keyboard of the piano. It has a hole for every half step in the Western scale. The Western scale is based on the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, and there is a half step between mi and fa, and a half step between ti and do, and the vocabulary of the Western scale is the vocabulary of the scale of C. So mi and fa in the scale of C is E to F. So there is no E sharp. It is F natural. There is no F flat. It is E natural. And T do in that scale of C is B to C. So there is no B sharp. It is C natural, and there is no C flat. It is B sharp. And that is you knew that, of course, and that's basic to this understanding. So here are the holes. Here is the C sharp hole. The C sharp is, of course, the leading tone of the scale of D, and the flute is based on the scale of D. We'll talk about that more in part 2 of Understanding Your Flute, which will be titled How You Got It. This is part 1. It is subtitled What You Got. Here's what you got. You have a C sharp hole, and then the one here that you cover with your thumb is the C natural hole. And then you have the B natural hole and the B flat hole and the A natural hole and the A flat hole, which is called the G sharp hole because the vocabulary of your flute is the vocabulary of the scale of D, because it's based on the D flute. We'll talk about that later. Your flute happens to have 2 G sharp holes. We'll talk about that later, but for the purposes of this exercise, I'm going to put a cork in one of them because you only need one. And this is actually how Theobald Boehm actually designed your flute. He didn't have this hole. Somebody put it in later for other reasons. We'll talk about that later. So here is your G sharp hole, and the next hole below it is your G hole, and your F sharp hole, your F natural hole, your E hole, half step, half step, half step, your D sharp hole, and your D natural hole. And this will be your C sharp hole, and the end of the flute is your C natural hole. And with my C natural hole, you might go down to a B, in which case you just continue to talk down your flute. You'll figure it out for yourself. What is important to remember is that the end of the flute is a sound hole. All of your sound holes are finger holes, even though you don't have enough fingers, but we'll fix that. And one sound hole is not a finger hole. It's the end of your flute. So at this point, I'm going to ask you to bear with me and help me to write a standard science fiction story. Science fiction stories are all the same. They are the what-if stories. What if the laws of averages failed one day and everybody in Manhattan decided they wanted to go to Brooklyn? That's a science fiction story. What if gravity varied with the weather? So when on a low gravity day, Vonnegut wrote this one, you could pick up a manhole cover and climb to the top of the Empire State Building and fling it off like a frisbee. What if stories? What if those blue M&Ms were special pills that gave you the ability to evolve 100 times faster than a virus? So the title of our story, which we're going to write together right now, please bear with me, is The Lamarckian Flautist. So to begin with, you're going to have to do something. You're going to want to cover the C-sharp hole, which we cover, as Boehm did, with the first finger of your left hand. And this means you will be playing a C, because the C hole is the one that is sounding. And then the C hole is covered by your thumb, which is the way Boehm did it. And then the B hole here, you don't have enough fingers. There's no finger to cover the B hole. Your middle finger of your left hand covers the B flat hole, and so the B hole, you're going to need to grow a new finger right here in between these two to cover the B hole. So we'll get to work on that right now. Lamarck, of course, was that, I never looked him up, so I'm probably wrong about this, that biologist, the 19th century biologist, who was the first guy to realize that the dynamics of evolution were stronger than could possibly be explained by mere accidental variation and natural selection. And I think he was accused of saying something like the giraffe has a long neck because he needs one, because he wanted to get to the leaves. And that's what we're doing. And then you did eat a blue M&M once in your life. I mean, I never have myself, of course, because who would eat a blue M&M? But you did, and admit it. And if not, go find one. And then you'll be able to grow that finger to cover the B. So this is, and remember this, because as we go on, I'm going to ask you to remember these extra fingers you had to grow. Now, the next one is the ring finger, and that covers the A. This is your A fingering. If you cover the B flat hole and the B hole, which is the extra finger, then the G sharp, the A hole is sounding, and you cover the A hole with your ring finger, and then it is the G sharp hole that is sounding, and you cover the G sharp hole with your little finger. I'm going to, taking all the keys off of here as you see, I'm going to give you back this key with the C sharp hole, because it's a terrible reach, and I don't think you should have to grow an extra joint in your little finger to do that. So I'm just going to give you back this key. It's a simple key. You see, everything on the flute that moves is soldered to a silver tube. And I don't know what that tube is called in the business, but I'm going to call it a sleeve, the silver sleeve. Everything that moves is soldered to a silver sleeve, and the silver sleeves all run with a steel inside. This is called a steel, and so the steel goes, well, the key goes here. These are the posts, of course, that anchor the keys, and sometimes they go clean through, and this and that. And I'm just going to put this key back on for you. I'm only doing this to make your life easier. And you will notice, can you see that the end of this steel is a point, and the screw thread and a point? There are screws, all kinds of screws on your flute, and some of them have points on them. And just notice that. We'll talk about it later, but I want you to see the point. Let me know when you've got a good picture of it. Not yet. Good, okay. So we put the steel goes through, see, and I'm not going to bother to screw it in. There's threads in here. So there you go. Okay, now you've covered the C hole, the C sharp hole with your first finger, and you're playing a C, which is, this is your C sound hole. You covered that with your thumb. You're playing a B natural, which you're covering with a new finger, which you've just evolved because the giraffe needs to eat the leaves. And your middle finger covers the B flat hole, just like always, and your ring finger, now you're fingering an A, that's your A fingering, and your ring finger covers the A hole, and you go to G sharp. What's the problem? Okay, the G sharp, your little finger, ooh, you're gonna have to stretch your little finger a little bit, grow that, grow your little finger longer, okay? I'll give you a second, good, very good, okay. The giraffe is, ooh, G sharp, good, good, good. And that's your left hand, and you're all set. But you have, remember this, you have evolved an extra finger right there. And that's where it is, and remember that. Now we come to you. This is, assume this is all closed. We come to your right hand, and again, there's no finger for the G hole. You're covering the G sharp hole. You're playing a G. You must grow an extra finger. It comes right out of here. See, they had one back in the old days. Some of the old flutes had one. It was called a vaulted clutch, but you will grow a new finger there. Remember, that's the place, and so that covers your G hole, and that gives you the F sharp, and the first finger of your right hand covers the F sharp hole, which gives you an F natural, and your middle finger covers the F natural hole, and that gives you an E natural, and your ring finger covers the E natural hole, which gives you a D sharp, D flat, D sharp, and your little finger covers the D sharp hole, and you're all set, because here is your D hole, and that is the bottom of your flute. The D foot is the shortest foot that a flute can have. And you can add anything you want to the end of it, as long as the holes are open, and you just have to grow extra fingers here on the side of your hand, which I don't want to ask you to do, because I don't want you to remember them. I only want you to remember these two extra fingers, which you've had to grow. And I also want to get away from this science fiction because you might get tired of it and just shut the tube off, and I can't hardly blame you. Okay, so we've gone down, and we can go back up. I don't know why we need to, but you can do that on your own. It's middle of the night sometime when you can't sleep. And let me just take this key off. We're not going to finger it anymore, so I'll just take this key right off and get it out of the way here. And you will notice, I'm not really going to talk about the mechanics of the flute. The mechanical things are easy for some people and hard for others, and if they're easy for you, you can do it on your own, and if they're hard for you, it ain't going to happen anyway. But I did leave the trill keys, just because, mostly because, I don't want to have to make you evolve extra fingers to cover the holes, because that would be, the whole idea here is to understand the flute, not to turn you into a contortionist. So I happen to have here, and it's a good example, a simple, good example of how the mechanics of your flute work, is the lowest touch on your trill, I'm sure you have noticed, works the highest trill key. And the highest touch on your trill, the mechanism, works your lower trill key. And this is universal. All flutes are like this. Trust me, your flute is like this. The reason is simple. There's one long steel rod runs through the whole thing, and the lower trill key, which is soldered to a silver tube, we'll call it a sleeve, like all things that move on your flute, is attached to that steel rod. And this attachment is very silly. I've never seen one like this before. This is a gold star flute made in Chicago, probably in 1940, a student flute. But you see that big screw right there? and that squeezes, and this little crack here, it actually squeezes the tube onto the steel. And so when you move the lower trill key, it moves the whole steel rod. And then the upper trill key is attached to the steel rod also. And I don't know how this one is. Usually there's a pin, a hole drilled through it, and the pin, you can find the pins on your flute. But this one is a piece of junk, and it's probably just pinched with a pair of pliers or something, or glued, or but stuck there somehow. So the lower trill key moves the whole steel inside and moves the upper trill, lower trill touch, upper trill key. The upper trill touch is soldered to a long piece of silver, a long silver sleeve, which is not attached to the steel. There's just a lot of oil in there, and the lower trill key is also soldered to the silver tube, as are all things that move on a flute, and it is also on the same tube. So when you touch the upper trill touch, the lower trill key, the whole tube moves on the steel. The lowered one moves the steel, the upper one moves the sleeve on the steel. It's very simple, and that's how it works. And that's the beginning of understanding the mechanics of your flute, but it will get more complicated as time goes on. Let me see, I have discussed the reason for the little C-sharp hole, and I think this is a good time to call Understanding Your Flute, episode 1, to an end. So join me for episode 2. You will need your flute for episode 2, so you might want to dig it out before you start. And this is to be continued. I am Dustin, D-U-S-T-I-N, and you'll find me on YouTube, and I have a website if you wish to buy a wooden spoon. You see, I'm a real smart guy. I was smart enough not to know better than to make my living playing the flute. I make my living carving wooden spoons. It's not that much smarter, but the website is dandustin.com, I think, or something like that. So thank you for your attention, and I'll see you soon.